start up with big projects again soon. Okay, you're on camera, folks.
Did you go to the coffee house, Bill?
I did.
Yeah.
It's the best coffee house we've ever had.
Yeah, it was only one painful act.
You.
Honestly, you should. I'm just being honest.
Welcome to Camden's Energy and Sustainability Committee meeting of December 16th. And it's great to have you here. So, Pearl and Anita and Anna and Phil, oh my goodness. Bruce, Sarah, Brian. Wow. Sorry about the shreds. It had a new page. It had new page where it was supposed to be new column, and so overprinted. So I don't know if we can quite yet set our January meeting. Normally it would be January 20th, and as I mentioned in an email, Oh, of course, that's right. And then the month after, it's Washington's Day. We always run into that problem at the beginning of the year, in January and February.
What is the 20th?
Martin Luther King Day. So we cannot meet on Martin Luther King Day. That's a town holiday, so we're not allowed to meet.
Hi there.
Hi,
Sorry, I'm late.
Nancy.
Is that because we can't meet here or just?
They don't want us to meet on town holidays. That's my understanding.
So not January.
So not January 20th for sure. Here's Mark. Hi, Mark. Oops. Sorry. So, Nancy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nancy Jenkins, and I don't know whether I'm on the committee or not. I have bowed down in obeisance to the select board, but I haven't heard anything back from you.
The select board will consider committee
Sorry?
appointment. The select board will consider committee appointments tomorrow.
Okay, all right. Well,
And
I hope that I pass.
your application is there, along with another person's application that came in
okay.
September.
I'm on the slipper. Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Are you breathing?
What?
Are you breathing?
Am I breathing? Just barely.
There are two applications, Mark.
Oh, okay.
So,
Just barely. I just raced to get here.
so I can't promise. I don't know what the select board will do, but I just want you to know that there was an application that came in
Well,
September.
maybe they'll prefer that person.
I don't know how they're going to figure that out, but I'll try to keep out of it so it doesn't get complicated. So anyway, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So on January 7th Select Board meeting, there will be a discussion, I believe, it was called an energy discussion. The agenda was not posted
That's 'cause
yesterday.
That's because we're still posting for tomorrow.
Right. So I can't promise to the extent to which energy will be discussed, but I believe they'll be talking about the real-term report or probably the solar report. And then,
That's what the topic, I mean, when you say energy, it's this, probably the solar?
well, the solar, but not in depth. it'll be sort of preliminarily discussed, and then a workshop will be scheduled. This is my understanding. I don't know if I'm right. A workshop will be scheduled for later on in January to discuss only energy, because they need to make a decision based on the report and a number of other things that are coming up as to what direction they want to go for the town. So,
Is that a decision meeting, or is that to kick off a process that would result in
You
decision?
can't
The
make,
workshop?
you can't make decisions, take votes in a workshop. We have to do the votes in a regular select board meeting. So let's discuss it. But we will be talking about, I'm going to bring up energy tomorrow as part of my discussion before they get into the meat of the meeting. And
Chris-
talking about the workshop and stuff like
it's
that.
on the agenda, is it not?
No, it's part of my report. I have plans to talk about energy
Oh.
tomorrow.
Okay. All right. So Bob Falciani asked me if we could meet subsequent to January 7th and prior to the workshop, in case we have some advice for the workshop. So I think I'll just have to be in touch with you about that time. There are not a whole lot of choices. What's the choice? There may be a venue question as well, because if it's not our usual meeting time, someone else might be using it. 13th would be the Monday. Does anybody have any particular day of the week that they really don't want to, or would be unable to meet?
Wednesday.
Wednesday? Okay.
Tuesday.
Okay. Well, maybe 13th.
Or- Oh, okay.
Maybe just pencil in the 13th, but I'm not sure.
What day is the week?
It's a Monday.
Oh, that's right, it's Monday. Okay.
January 13th.
Yeah. Okay.
Same time, 5:30 to 7.
So I'd like to have your feedback on the minutes.
Just to mention, on the 13th, there is nobody scheduled for this room yet, so most
So we
likely
could
would
jump
be
on it.
fine to move it here.
Mm-hmm. That'd be good. Did you have a chance to look at the minutes? Any comments on the minutes? From November 18th.
I move to accept the minutes.
Uh,
And I looked at them online, the ones you sent.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All right. You accept the minutes? Okay. All right, minutes are accepted. Good. Phil, we need some mics turned on for those who are talking, whatever. Maybe you guys can share or something. That'd be great. Thanks. So the town is looking at a number, wait a minute. I want to ask you whether you have any non-agenda items that you'd like to bring up today. It's not on the agenda. I have something. Janet McMahon emailed me late this afternoon asking, and we'll discuss this later on, but I just wanted to mention that she said that the watershed climate change class is going to break with their previous tradition and actually address the Global Covenant of Mayors work for their entire class. So instead of just the last 7 weeks, which is really great for Camden. And so they're going to be working on the action plan, and they would like to know if members of the committee could meet with the class in late January, early February. So let's talk about I don't know, would she set the date then, Pete, you think, and we,
Probably it would be during class time
Yeah,
would
yeah.
be ideal.
Yeah, I've also been in touch with her, and because I asked her about her and I meeting with members of the select board, and she said that it might be helpful to have us all meet as part of the class. Because she kind of wants this to be a collaboration every step of the way. I'm just reading her email to me now. Can I just read this?
move this non-agenda item up to the present time, because I do think it's important and it's timely.
Yeah.
So we'll proceed with this.
So she says, I view this as a collaboration with Watershed doing research, compiling information, assessing what's possible, while working with the town to fine-tune targets and recommendations. We will be looking at what is being proposed at the state level as well, and what will likely affect town decision-making. We are not going into this with preconceived goals. These will be developed as we go through the action planning process. So I think I'm going to meet with her this week to talk about how that's going to go. But I think that she is looking to set up a meeting with Audra, Allison, and Jeremy to talk about what actions the town is currently taking. And to answer their questions about the action planning process. And so that's kind of, I think she's looking to set up a meeting with the class and the energy committee, and probably the class and members on the select board. So that's where that's at currently.
That'd be great. Are there members who are particularly interested in participating and that want to be sure that they can be included? Pete? Phil? Anybody else wants to be sure they can be included?
Send out notice maybe and to everybody.
Pardon?
Send out notice to.
I will, for sure. I'm not going to be exclusive about the notice.
Yeah, no, I just,
Yeah. Okay.
said rather than commit to. Great.
I would sort of just bring up, if you're meeting with her, Mark's point from the last meeting, which is that the sooner, if I recall it correctly, you can correct me, that the select board is informed the better in the process so that they don't get taken by surprise. Right.
I think that's Janet's intent is
Yeah.
to coordinate much more closely this year than before.
If you can mention to Janet, when she meets with Audra, should have me as part of that meeting as well.
Yes.
And Allison. It's Allison.
Well, it's pretty exciting that they're going to be working on this for the whole class. It's really a gift for the town. So we're very lucky. So let's do an update on the town work related to energy. There are a number of things on the table. There's the what can we do right away? What can we do sort of long-term? And how can we move forward on multiple fronts? One option is that is being considered, and again, this will be revealed in the workshop and in the meeting on, probably also the meeting tomorrow, just as how they're approaching the offsetting of the municipal's carbon footprint in terms of electrical energy. So one is to purchase more renewable, what is it, REC is a renewable energy credit, is that what it's called?
Certificate.
Renewable energy certificate, RECs. So presently, we have a certain percentage of RECs, 30-something%, isn't it?
I think in addition to solar, I thought it was higher than that, but I'm not sure. I thought it was 65%, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'd have to
I think
double
it's
check.
Percent of what?
So the municipal energy demand, instead of buying it from
CMP?
the standard
He
offer,
doesn't. Yeah.
it would be from Constellation Energy, which is renewable credits, which are produced probably out there in South Dakota or somewhere by wind or who knows where, and it's sort of the credits. We're buying that energy. So one option, presently we're buying a certain percentage, which I can look up if I have a moment, or maybe one of you can look it up if you have that.
I believe it's everything that's not. All the large and medium, the medium and large accounts are through Constellation. And everything else is standard offer. But in effect, the large accounts like the Snowball and the waste treatment plant are Constellation.
Right.
And if you look on my spreadsheet, you can see which ones are which.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
How does everybody feel about buying RECs as opposed to getting involved in our own solar situation? I'd like to get a
Go
feeling of
ahead,
that.
Anna, you did some research on this.
Yeah, I feel strongly that not all RECs are created equally, and even when we looked into Constellation's portfolio a little bit, most of them were from wind in Texas and then Northwest and in the Midwest. In the Midwest, not all. Some of them were not from renewable sources; they were just from clean sources, and so many factors come into how great and valuable a REC is. Buying a REC from like wind in New England, where we don't have as much open space, is much. There's a lot more additionality in where you buy a wind REC, just depending on how much is being produced there. Long story short, it's much better to have your own sustainable or renewable source than to get into any REC market that isn't hyper-local. And Constellations they were purchasing from all over, and there was a percentage of their certificates that were not even coming from fully renewable sources.
Yeah, to just amplify that point, for example, there is an option that you can, there is an option for consumers, if you want to not have the standard offer. I looked into that for, if you're in Maine, you can opt for quote unquote clean, and I can't remember the name of the company, but effectively you get the disclosure as to where their energy comes from, and all of it is carbon, but they've purchased RECs so to offset them. So effectively they're saying, oh, look, you're buying RECs, but all your energy is being produced by fossil fuels. So it's a giant scam, effectively.
Well, it's, I would assume that if you're buying RECs, you are providing funding for sustainable energy to be produced. Right.
Instead of directly saying, no, I want my energy from, for example, we sold our renewable energy credits for our solar farm.
Who is we?
Well, the owners of the farm, which is Revision's.
Sagamore, are you talking about the Sagamore installation?
Shareholders. Revision shareholders that own our, the power.
That's the PPA investors.
The PPA investors.
In our Sagamore farm.
In our Sagamore farm.
Array.
They have sold those RECs to companies that want or need the RECs, so that they can then use fossil fuel sources instead of renewable sources, right? So in other words, if there's a need for a company to be certain, have a certain amount of their energy use.
They're being double counted then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So effectively, what we have we can say, well, we've sold our RECs, which means whatever we use from our solar farm is effectively, you could think of it as it's a one-to-one correspondence between our solar farm and somebody else saying, well, we're not going to do solar because we just bought your credit so we can use fossil fuels. So any future, I mean, the reason why RECs, they are a financial, they make solar PPAs more financially viable for municipalities because the cost goes down. But effectively, what you're saying is, yes, we want to lower cost, but by doing that, by selling those RECs to get the lower cost, you're saying, okay, we're effectively incentivizing other people not to use renewable energy and to buy the RECs instead.
Well, thanks, Pete. That helps explain it a little bit. It is complicated.
I mean, this
Around the
was-
table
that
about
was
this, or?
I'm curious what, if.
Okay, I just want to make certain that we're following up on your initial request.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's go around the table. Anna, did you say what you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, I think I said my piece, but I also do think that some RECs are an investment in future renewable projects, but a lot of verification has to go into it. So I do think there is a place for RECs and getting on a REC market if you truly are an array and you have room to expand and that it would support. I have a really good primer on RECs and just the system at large from the New England Wind Fund, which they sell RECs and retire them in New England, and they have a really good primer on it that I'd be happy to send around to everyone.
What do you mean retire them?
So when you as an individual or a town or whatever, when you purchase a REC and you get a certificate, it depends on the state legislation how soon they have to be retired. So there's a whole system in like the purchase of an offset versus a REC versus a credit, and part of what differentiates them is how soon they need to be retired. So some certificates have to be retired within a year, whereas some really are more future oriented and have, in some states, as long as they are retired within 10 years, you can purchase that certificate now to offset carbon, a carbon energy source.
Is there a way you can give us that reference so that it can go into the notes?
Yeah, I can send that around. You mean?
Like, so that she can put it in the minutes so that, and it can get out to others that might be interested in looking
What do
those
you
up?
mean, the link you want?
The link that she's talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have, can you get that tonight? Like,
Oh, yeah. So a lot of it comes from, it all comes from greenenergyconsumersalliance.org. And they operate a wind fund and RECs. It's their New England Wind Fund. They don't extend it to Maine, but it's Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island.
so that's where the primer, they pronounce it
I'm
primer,
sure,
don't they?
yeah.
Both now.
Yeah, it's
Both are correct.
I've done a lot of work with them in Massachusetts.
Great.
But
Fantastic.
I don't have a firm grasp, and I should, of the legislation around retirement here. But I think if the town is just buying them from an energy company like Constellation, it depends on where they're purchased, what the retirement, how quickly they need to be used.
So I think that the town, my understanding, talking with Bob, is that the town is going to be looking at what they can do right away. I mean, they can buy RECs right away, right? So.
It's dangerous not knowing where
Yeah.
you're buying them
So
from. and-
would,
yeah.
would we be correct in understanding that it's better than nothing? And it's fine until we can do something
It
that's more real?
depends. It
As long as
depends.
it's not stopping us from moving forward.
As long as it
Yeah.
doesn't stop us from moving forward.
Be a
Keep going
reduced
around.
incentive
Okay.
to do anything meaningful if it's not what we thought it would be.
When I first was reading about these, it sounded like
Phil
a
Gerard.
good way to scale photovoltaics. But I think it's like a lot of things, like mortgages are a good idea, and business finance is a good idea, but financial instruments usually have enough slack in them that you can cause trouble. So if you bundle mortgages and you start selling bundles, it's a completely different deal. So I think that from that perspective, you can't count on them to be a good idea. And so they have to be vetted. I don't have the expertise, I don't know. It sounds like here's someone who has a heads up on it, and perhaps if you speak directly with some sort of cooperative or association of people who are completely associated with wind or solar, they might be able to provide some information. But I guess I'm with everybody so far. It seems like you want to really proceed with caution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bruce Means?
Yeah, I guess I would second that. I don't feel like I'm well enough informed. It sounds like Anna's sort of really well into this, but far enough to know that there's so many uncertainties for us to make a big play, like a town play to invest heavily in RECs might be to our disadvantage if what we're really trying to do is offset footprint somehow. And yeah, but I don't know enough about it to feel great about a decision either way on it.
Thank you. Brian Robinson?
Much like my distinguished colleague to my left, I don't feel like I have enough knowledge, so I'm looking forward to reading what Anna will send me to be able to react effectively. But in general, my gut tells me we're better to own our own rather than be subject to the, is it vicissitudes? Is that the right? Am I getting that? Is that of a new pronunciation? Yeah? Okay, sorry, I should defer to my editor, I suppose. I'm looking at the professor. To me, that just makes more sense, and I feel a little bit silly that I didn't realize that the solar RECs for up there were not in our control or being retired, because certainly that was my intention, but you buy your first car and you learn things, and this is my sort of first solar purchase, so to speak.
Can I add before we get too far around here?
Yes, Bruce.
It just seems like we're not the only group that must be asking these questions. So aren't there some national associations that are trying to set the criteria?
I do have a card of somebody who's basically selling themselves as a REC expert consultant. So I have tried to reach out to him once, but didn't.
Before they start, one or the other.
But I tried to reach out to this person that I met at that NRCM meeting in Belfast last year, and hasn't gotten back to me. So, but there are people that are like, this is all they do, is advise on RECs.
Well, I would just say that what
Sarah
are
Miller?
comparable to RECs were the offset, I forget, it's under Article 6, blah, 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 were discussed at length at the meeting just over in Paris, in Madrid. And that environmental organizations were somewhat split, but tended by and large to be negative about the whole thing. And
being RECs?
Yeah.
What are comparable to RECs? They have a different name if you're selling them internationally through the United Nations. Well, the United Nations program doesn't exist. Basically, they were unable to pass this in Madrid for a variety of reasons, but one of which was that there were significant objections to it from, if you will, the environmental community and those who want really strong action. And one of the major reasons that they gave was double selling, which is exactly what's being done. I'm kind of shocked to hear that we've sold RECs for the same power that
for the same
But we didn't have any
generated
power of them because we weren't the investors, right?
that we need, that we're counting. I mean, one or the other of us gets to count that, but not both.
But we can't count, I mean, effectively, we cannot count Sagamore Farms as carbon zero if we sold the RECs.
We shouldn't, but we do, don't we?
We can't control what the investors do with their investment.
We can say to whoever does our solar farm, we don't want to sell our RECs. And that will, the cost will go up.
So I would say that, to me, I would strongly recommend that we basically rely as a heavy first priority on our own projects, doing our own things.
Okay.
Or things that we know absolutely where they are and what's being done, like a big group solar project. I wouldn't have a problem with that. That would be fine.
Yeah.
But not, a wind farm that's supposedly only been sold once in Texas and may have been sold twice or may not exist.
Pearl Benjamin, do you have anything to say?
I also feel as though I don't have enough information to have a very strong opinion on the matter. I think that it sounds like the way that we've been headed in terms of having our own array sounds like the right way to go, but I'd love to learn more.
Well, I'd be curious about whether to buy a REC, let's say for the next year, to buy a RECs to cover all of our electrical consumption doesn't mean that in the following year, once we have our act together and we actually have purchased solar, then we have our own, basically, right?
A new member, or possible new member, I'd like to hear what she has to say too.
Okay.
Well,
Do you have anything to say?
Do you have anything to offer on that?
No, I don't think I should.
Okay,
I'm not a member of the committee.
That's okay, I'm looking for.
Well,
knowledge. Do you
I
have
always
any
think
knowledge?
that home-grown and home-controlled is better than being controlled by people in Texas. I mean, this the story of CMP, if you will. When it was a homegrown company, it worked, and it doesn't work so well anymore. I just feel in general that if we're trying to do something, I would love to see something that expands beyond the town of Camden and includes the entire, let's say, mid-coast region or Knox and Waldo counties or something like that. But I think we have it in our power to do this and to control it.
Well, the reason I ask is I think there's a way for us to go forward as a town where we really, maybe even buy our own without using a PPA, actually get our own farm and do that. But my concern is I'm not interested in using solar that so somebody else can feel comfortable about using fossil fuels.
Right, exactly.
And it sort of seems like the game there. Yeah. And I'm not interested in that because that doesn't accomplish what we need to accomplish. Right. So. I was just sort of curious where we were, but that's sort of how I feel about it. And I'll bring that up tomorrow.
Thank you. Are you familiar with did somebody else want to?
Well, I have a question in connection with resources, whether anyone, maybe I should do this, but there's the American Public Power Association, which is the association of several thousand community-owned or city-owned power plants. It's quite common in the U.S. The first ones were municipally owned. They were not owned privately. And there's still quite a few of them, and there are lots of stories of people taking over the infrastructure in their town or in a particular district because of mismanagement or because they know they could do it cheaper. But anyway, this association has been around for quite some time, and I wonder, given the rise of alternative energy, I think I sent you a little brochure, not little, 40 pages or so, that describes the whole process of how a town goes about taking over the infrastructure and doing their own power. And they don't have to produce their own power. They can buy power and then take care of distributing it, or they can do the power and distribute it. But at any rate, they may have, might be a great resource. I've never, whether they should be contacted as, it's a big association. I think there's more than 2,000 towns and cities in the association.
Well, this is where the upcoming bill that's being proposed by Seth Berry may be of interest to us, which is effectively a state chartered nonprofit organization buying CMP and Emera. And as Seth says, without a solid foundation to electrify the state, we won't be making any strides to minimize our fossil fuel footprint. We need a grid that is amenable to wind and solar and distributed production. And so one of the things that Seth and this bill would accomplish is to have a state agency that is dedicated to not only expanding production, but expanding renewable production in the state without corporate involvement. So if that's something to learn about and to spread the word on, because I think that's a pretty exciting prospect, and that if we're serious about minimizing carbon footprint, we must expand the grid. We've got to have a whole lot more electrical production to take care of moving from oil heat to electric heat pumps and what have you, electric charging stations, and CMP has been dragging their feet on that kind of production. So hopefully.
Can I ask a question that's relevant to Constellation and whether or not the town goes forward with the purchase of RECs? Is it on the table that they would potentially, the town could use a different provider of RECs than Constellation? Because where you purchase them definitely matters, and a lot of that, where it matters, and the portfolio that a company might pool and aggregate RECs from is very state dependent. Like in Massachusetts, this really does matter because there are portfolio standards within the state. They have to increase their class 1 sources of renewable energy, and so RECs can only be retired there if they are all from class 1 sources, whereas Constellation, most of their sources were class 2 or 3. But there are providers of RECs that have only class 1, which isn't sources. So this would be a moot conversation if the town wasn't, if Constellation was the only group that CMP works with. But if they work with others, or if there are options, I feel like we could
I found it difficult. I think it's difficult in Maine to find those. I mean, it certainly is at the consumer level. I was not able to find any source.
Or I sent everyone in Massachusetts how the links to how the REC system works and where they can be purchased from, and at an individual level how you could buy in and where they source their RECs from. I'd be happy to look into a little bit if there is a company like that services Maine, but I'm new to CMP. But if the town had options outside of Constellation, it would be good to know.
Well, there's this new thing, MPO, the Maine Power Options, and that's something that was just came about because of the recent bills in the legislature. And so we're going to look into, and I'm sort of unclear, Bob and I have talked about it, sort of unclear about what they offer, but we've talked about maybe Bob, Audra, and I going to Augusta to meet with them to find out more about that.
So I will read a little bit from their site as to what they are. I believe this is newly formed by the state.
Yeah, because of the recent work by the legislature, it was allowed to be formed.
So the purpose of Maine Power Options, which is mainpoweroptions.org, is to bring together or pool local and governmental and nonprofit organizations, analyze their combined energy needs, and negotiate pricing with suppliers to achieve the best value for our member organizations. By joining the Maine Power Options aggregation, your organization's buying power will be greatly enhanced with all future electricity and fuel oil purchases. The organization is currently comprised of over 800 member organizations throughout the state. On behalf of our members, we assume all administrative responsibilities associated with energy bids and contract negotiation process with potential suppliers. Competitive pricing offers are then presented to members for consideration and voluntary participation.
So there's nothing about renewable energy
They
per
do have a
se?
green power program.
It's an aggregator of.
Wait, who has the Green Power Program?
Green power options.
Okay.
So that's something that the board will also be looking into.
Yes.
Now that apparently it's only just been created this
Right.
year.
Yes.
As you said, because the legislation was put into effect that enables that to actually exist, and then they are kind of putting fine tuning on the contract verbiage and so on. So Camden is poised to look seriously at that option, the Main Energy Purchasers Consortium. So that's a great thing to be thinking about. With regard to solar PV expansion, Sagamore Farm is still not off the table, and that's the report that came back from Richard Roughgarden is going to be discussed also as part of this workshop, and some decisions there. What is also being considered is to invest in a bigger supply and be the town be the investors. Well, they actually believe they found a way to invest without bonding or costing town taxpayer funds.
Who does?
And that's-
Sorry, I've gotten confused here.
Well, the town is looking seriously at investing in something like an offshore wind or some expanded solar, but the town being the investor. So that's still so much in the formation stage that it really can't be discussed further until the select board wrestles with it. But that only to say that the town is moving as aggressively as they can to make something happen in this regard. So
Could you define moving as aggressively as they can in some sort of objective manner?
Well, I can say it's, in our discussions, we talk about it all the time. We're looking to expedite putting solar on our buildings as we move forward, to at least take that next step as quickly as possible. And then looking into farms and stuff. And we're just sort of in that period of, okay, we've seen the report, what can we do and what can we do fast? And those are the conversations that these next meetings will be talking about.
So I'm encouraged by the heightened interest that the town has in doing something fast, even though it feels like, I have actually expressed frustration at the slowness of it. So it's a pretty big investment. All these arrays, this kind of investment is pretty big, and the town's trying to find the right way to do it. There's something else I meant to update on that I see I didn't annotate on the agenda that relates to updates of the town work. And that is that I realized I didn't bring my notes, so I'm trying to work out a memory, which is not that effective these days. And help me if you can. But so the town put out to bid the public safety building. Has energy issues in their machinery. But they are also looking at, remember what,
I'm not sure where you're going yet, so you got to talk a little further.
Yeah, I know.
Basically, what I can say is,
We can't move right away on that machinery because we're
No,
looking for.
there's, we looked for proposals to, that the HVAC system at the public safety building has been broken and not working and never worked really well for a long time. So we finally have had people look at it, make proposals. There's one we're looking at, but there's another company that's come in recently that's both looking at helping energy conservation at public safety building and some other buildings as well. And we're waiting for that, those meetings to happen, so then we can start to make some decisions about let's move forward. And, you know, whether it's installing heat pumps or whatever it's going to be, there's a bunch of options, but we're looking to, you know, modernize and save energy at a lot of the town buildings.
So there's a
So
company
what-
that makes the improvements like what you're talking about and promises a certain efficiency and then gives that
Basically, there's a company that we're talking to, and I've been told we're not ready to discuss the specifics of it yet.
okay, all right.
So I can't go any further.
So would it be safe to say that if we're replacing heating systems, we're not going to be replacing them with fossil fueled systems? That should be a priority, I would think.
Yeah, it'd be electric, I believe.
Okay.
I don't know the specifics of the deals, I just know that we're moving forward to save situations.
Will you be able to keep us informed when that, when the proposal becomes public, presumably before it gets approved or voted on?
Oh, yeah.
The reason I say that is that when this heating system in this building was replaced, it was very much done in an emergency manner, and the boiler that we got was the boiler that happened to be available, and it ended up being very much like for like, and as opposed to taking that opportunity to get us off of the
Right.
6,000 gallons of fossil fuel, we locked ourselves into another 50 years of it.
And unfortunately, at the time when the boiler broke, it was in the middle of winter, and we had no choice. It wasn't like we could take, that was my understanding.
Yeah, well, that was some people's understanding. It was not my understanding, but from several companies that I spoke with that could have spec'd other objects in there. But it's great that we're hopefully looking forward and doing it before the system breaks.
Yes.
And I think that's a critical thing to be learned from this process, is that we need to look forward and say, aha, we may not be ready to do this yet, but we should be investigating what we should do when we decide to pull the trigger, as opposed to getting into that reactive situation in the dead of winter and the boiler dies.
Yeah, and also, if we, you know, I would hope that whatever framework or goals that this third-year process with the Covenant of Mayors, it would preclude replacing things with fossil fuel. In other words, in our goals, we would say at any time that heating systems malfunction or need replaced, they must not be replaced. So there needs to be a little bit of teeth so that can't ever happen again.
So that's a good element to make sure is included in those goals. Right. Thank you. Snowball. Brian, were you able to get that report into?
I haven't been able to get it in. I've been doing some updating to it, and one of the things I'm trying to incorporate is what the current actual fuel usage is at the Snowball versus the facility as a whole, because the information that I've been able to access doesn't distill that one building from the maintenance building or from the.
So have you checked the spreadsheet to see if they're broken out, the one that I put together?
I'm going to look at that one.
Because it may very well be that those accounts are split on that account? I mean, I don't know, but that would be the first place to look.
I think that I had double checked there, but this was, right after our last meeting, but I need to double check that and make sure to see where we're at. The one sort of complicating factor there is that because it's a commercial kitchen downstairs, we don't have accurate data on how often they're running the hoods, and venting a ton of heat outdoors because they've got a fryolator going. So it ends up being a bit more complicated process, but the rough estimate is insulating that uninsulated building would likely save about 50% to 60% of the current fuel usage, which actually needs to account for the propane that goes into running the grill and the electricity that goes into the fryer, because all of those things, while some of it.
60, you said, right?
Yeah, 50 to 60%. Some of that energy, some of it goes into changing the nature of the food, changing, whatever a potato is into starch. But most of it ends up getting lost into the building. But then it gets sucked back out of the building. And it's
So Brian
tricky
is
to account
talking
for
about,
that.
Brian's talking about, I didn't mention that for anybody listening, he's talking about the A-frame. So we're talking about, since the A-frame is now being considered to be, that the future intention is to keep the A-frame and use it for maybe non-public purposes, but continue to use it. We have an issue with the fact that it is either very poorly or not at all insulated, and asking Brian, he has some knowledge about its condition, and we'd like to get that information to the select board so that they can make a decision about that.
And the other piece of it is that currently there's a oil-fired boiler that's providing the heat and the hot water for the building. And no one has really looked seriously at, sort of what would the alternatives be for that. When and if it is to turn into, as you refer to it, although it's not, I don't believe the intention is it would be completely non-public, but it wouldn't be the primary. It may not going forward end up being the primary, base lodge for the Ragged Mountain Recreation Area. But it would still likely be used regularly throughout the heating season.
Basically, to clarify, the plans that the Ragged Mountain Foundation has done in terms of developing a new lodge include keeping that one as for the business, part of the business work that needs to go on, offices and.
Right, albeit it might possibly be at lower set points because it wouldn't be a place where you're coming in and taking your jacket off and
That's the
eating
plan.
lunch kind of
But
thing.
that whole plan is, we don't know, have any idea where that's going to go at this time.
So the decision to go forward with that plan has not been made.
Not
That's what
even
you're
close.
saying, is that has to be discussed. But the building, so the issue with the A-frame is that should it continue to be used as it is this year, it is an uninsulated building, certainly in terms of the A-frame part of it. The roof is only timber, no insulation. And Brian looked at that, the concrete part of it, but had some of that
There's no
insulated.
I mean, aside from the accessible bathroom, there's no insulation down there
Okay.
either.
So since they're going to be discussing energy this month, January, next month, do you think you can get what
Yeah,
information you have to them?
Yeah, I'll be back over there on Saturday to have some more access to it, and hopefully can tease out those other fuel numbers. And it will be exclusive to the A-frame because now there are two, what do you call them, modular satellite buildings, one for rentals and tickets, and the other, which is where the the
Side country
competition program and side country sports are located. Those, I haven't considered those. They're essentially temporary buildings, and it doesn't seem prudent to really include those, because the hope is that those are continue to only be temporary buildings, meaning they will go away. And that's part of the goal, I think, of the Ragged Mountain Recreation Foundation, is to kind of clean up the site and get rid of these very inefficient side buildings and get into one single, more effective central building that, is a lot more functional on a whole number of levels.
Okay, thank you. So they'll have something to sink their teeth into.
I'll get something out later this week or for next. I'm actually off next week, so I'll have some chance to do non-work related items.
Are things at a state with that, with the planning there that looking at the overall design from an energy conservation perspective is not going to happen?
Well, that's a good segue into the next.
Yeah.
You mean that energy conservation isn't going to happen?
No, in other words, are the plans developed enough that people will be invested in whatever plans are there and will be less interested in looking at looking at the overall picture of things from that perspective? In other words, for example, the A-frame perhaps could be a seasonal building. Looking from that, where you just leave it alone, you take the heating system out of it, you put in good ventilation system, and you leave it at that. And it's used when it can be used. In other words, there are ways of, they're starting to look in a lot of places about getting much more creative than simply refitting, but thinking, let's leave this building the way it is, and we'll build another simpler building, or, something, you can build a Butler building and put 8 inches of foam and put vestibules on it, and you're starting to get something that's really going to operate efficiently. But it doesn't look the way people want it to, but it works fine for non-public. So, there's that kind of approach that's very different than conventional architectural process.
I don't believe that level of creativity has been applied, and I think primarily, I would say because of donors that have already lined up and made pledges and commitments, and in some cases gifts towards the new lodge, that there is a larger aesthetic concern to,
Let's just say that energy use has been probably tertiary concern in the design of the building.
I wouldn't quite go that far, Pete. It's, the building was designed to, exceed the commercial codes that are required, and it's not, it would not be difficult to, to further upgrade, for that to be further upgrade. There is no set final design at this point, so I don't think that horse has left the stable, and I think it's incumbent upon us, and I suspect that the select board will be quite vigilant on this, given where we are now, which is very different from where we were half a dozen years ago.
Yeah.
And that leads into the next agenda item.
So the next agenda item is, given that the new lodge is back on the table for consideration to Snowball, it opens up the question of that and any and all other buildings that the municipality ultimately will own or is sponsoring the building of, the construction of. Does the Energy Committee want to recommend to the Select Board that the town make a commitment regarding the sustainability of the energy use of any new buildings? To that end, Pete drafted a document. Do you want to read it out loud, or do you want me to read it?
You've got it right there, so why don't you just do it? And just let me preface that by saying that's just a very, very early draft, just to get us going.
So ideally, we could together work on this draft and what we would like to propose to the town of Camden to consider with regard to new buildings. So this is the draft as it stands now, and I thank Sarah Miller and Anna Ford for making comments on the draft as it is, and let's continue to sort of work on it. The town of Camden was the first town in the state of Maine to join the Global Council of Mayors. I believe that is Covenant of Mayors.
Yeah, I'll make that change. Sarah
Okay.
noted it.
Not a biggie.
That's why we have a collaborative process.
And is now in the third and final year of planning for the adoption of carbon emission reduction goals. I'm incorporating some of these comments that were made. The goals will require a substantial reduction in the town's current carbon footprint. I'm wondering whether
Let's
How
not
that-
wordsmith it, just read through the thing and get the spirit, and then we can go about.
Let's do that, okay. In this context, the Energy Sustainability Committee recommends that the town of Camden adopt such and such a standard when planning for and building new municipal buildings. In addition, we recommend that each building be designed and built to operate with no carbon footprint. Every effort should be made to ensure that the buildings are carefully air sealed, insulated, ventilated, and glazed in accordance with current modern building science so that the energy demand of the building is low. Low energy use will minimize the need for solar or other non-carbon burning energy sources. So that's the first take on this draft. Would you like to move forward on crafting this together as a committee?
I don't think that's a good way to go. I think the better way to go is for people to put comments, and then that way I can incorporate everybody's comments, and then we can have draft 2, and people can comment on that. But I don't think this forum is useful.
Okay, so does anybody have any generic comments that they'd like to say with regard to the direction we're trying to go with this letter or this recommendation?
I think I missed last time, but this insert standard here thing.
Yeah, that was because I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what that standard. Yeah, and I was hoping that Brian could shed some light on what standard would be appropriate.
Is there a given standard?
I mean, we could say
that we
passive
could
house standard, but
use?
It's, the commercial stuff isn't quite as widely sort of available. There's not the single, there is a, the passive house is more residential, not so much commercial, but we could look towards that as, a standard. There gets to be a point at which they call it the passive house cliff, where you keep building and building and building and making it better and better and better, and eventually you don't need a heating system. And that's where you get this price drop in the building. So that it's you have to get to a certain point to make it pay for itself. But passive house doesn't necessarily mean you stop there. It means that sometimes you keep going well beyond that. So that last yard that you go doesn't gain you very much. And I think in an era of limited resources, we have to be prudent about getting there. And I haven't been able to find how you define that, where you get to sort of that point, because you want to make it, really good, but you don't have to try to make it perfect, because that can end up torpedoing the whole thing.
right. But what I want to get across, which I don't think I've done correctly, is that what we need to say is if you build the building, it better have zero operating footprint. So either you build it so that you don't have to have a lot of solar, or you find the solar, or you size the solar array that you're going to put with this building, or size up the solar array that the town has. In other words, you can't build the building unless you have the renewable energy to operate it.
Is the carbon footprint the right term, or do we want to say net energy demand?
Well, I think
Phil?
I would, being aware of how the issues with passive house as a standard, it's worth pointing out that Brussels decided that all new buildings, this was 5 years ago, will be built to passive house standards. And they are less expensive the larger they are in general, at least what that standard is.
You mean the EU? Is that?
in the European Union, yeah.
But is that the city of Brussels or the East?
City.
City of Brussels, yeah. For the city. The city has adopted.
Not the EU.
Oh, but I mean, I thought you said in the EU but yeah, no, not the EU. In other words, and you can read about what they've done since then, and at least it's a standard. And the fact is, although there's some things out there there's as Brian pointed out last time we met or the time before that. In architecture schools, there's often zero attention paid to some of these, how you get there. One of the things that Passive House has is a very robust program that's been developed over the last 30 years. And you can fiddle with that. If you want to find out where the cliff is as far as cost, or you want to say we're going to have solar in association with that, you can adjust some of the points that are connected with that. So, at any rate, it's an existing standard. Maybe it's too high. I don't really think so, actually. I mean, I think it's a good standard. There's a lot of buildings in Europe that have built to that standard. It seems to work.
So if somebody Googles Passive House standard, they'll find the information?
I started to say, is Passive House, that's capital P, capital H?
The way
That's what the standard is called?
Yeah.
Is that right?
PASSIVHAUS.
No, I know what the words are. The question
No,
is,
but it's
are
the
you just
it's
using a
German
generic
word. They're German
term,
words.
Or is there?
So it's not the same as passive solar or other things that are connected with.
So house is spelled
House,
German,
yes.
H-A-U-S?
PASSIVHAUS.
Oh, in German.
One word?
There's also a Passive House US that's different from the European standard and that is in conflict over certain things. But, I mean, if there's a problem finding the standard for writing this letter, there's one, and it's a very good one. And it's as far as the current code, it's quite a bit higher.
I would just note, and this is really just noting, I'm not expressing an opinion about anything, but Brussels has a lot milder weather than Maine. And I don't know whether that's a big issue.
These
but,
buildings have been built in Alaska to that standard.
To that, public buildings have.
Residential in the U.S. But there are plenty of places where they've been built in Northern Europe. So, you still, in general, will need a heating system, is my understanding. In colder climates, you're going to need a heating system. It's sort of a myth, but there is a latitude at which it's easier to get to the point where you're not going to need a heating system. We're north of that, is my understanding.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yes.
Both of us live in passive houses, and it's very, very little heating.
Yeah, it's minor, and you're supplying it efficiently with a heat pump, or, in some cases, it's more cost-effective to not even use a heat pump, to just use resistance electric, because the demand is so low. It's the equivalent of a couple of light bulbs.
I have a question, zooming out a little bit, just general tone of the letter, not getting into the specifics of what standards we want to recommend, or even the language around net zero or carbon footprint. Is the purpose of this is really basic, but maybe needs to be clear, new construction, or any building that the town would purchase in the future, even at existing standing, that would need to be retrofit?
I think that for simplicity's sake, and given what we're talking about in terms of the lodge, I think new construction is probably where we should go.
I think that could be somewhat clearer in the overall frame of the letter.
Did you put a comment to that effect?
No, but I will.
Okay.
I wanted to clarify.
I kind of had a similar question. Do we, if I recall the language correctly, and I'm not getting it back here without good internet connection, but I don't believe that it actually mentions at all the ski lodge or anything to do
No,
with
no,
it.
no.
Is that on purpose?
I
Have
think we want. I think we want to. I would like it to be generic.
Yeah.
Not for the ski lodge
No.
now, but to be applied later also, just, okay. I guess, okay.
Well, we need to start somewhere, and this is just sort of jump-starting that
Right. No, I don't
new
think that-
approach.
Yeah, and I mean, they're also, when you think about the wastewater treatment plant, you know, the question is, there's the building's energy demand, and then there's what, you know,
What it does.
what equipment we have in the building and what it's doing. Because if
Yes.
the building is housing 5011 pumps to pump sewage around and aerate them and do all these things, you know, that's different than the building demanding sort of zero energy to be, you know, at a comfort level essentially, and to provide for the
so-
function of the people that are there, because it's providing an external function.
Are we just talking about buildings people walk into and use? I mean, and then where do you draw the line? What about the fire station that has the big bay doors?
Well,
What about the
I-
public works garage?
I think an important thing is, this is a recommendation I think we want to keep it as this is what we recommend in broad strokes to the select board. For new buildings, that at some point, that would have to, you know, the select board would have to adopt something that was, you know, effectively an ordinance, if you will. So I don't think we're writing the ordinance. I think what we're saying is, we think you should do this. And then that becomes the town's responsibility to come up with the wording.
So, but what about public works garage?
I don't think we
versus
should get that specific.
building.
I think what we're doing is we're recommending that new buildings be built to some so that they don't use fossil fuels in their operating to operate. That's what I think that's what thing is supposed. I think this is what it should say, is that if you want to build a new building, you're going to have to prove that it doesn't use fossil fuels to operate.
Do we have, I mean, at the time that we'd make that recommendation, did we want to reserve something for existing and retrofitting? You know,
Well, I feel like it'd be
Tension is
easy.
there.
It would be better to keep things separate. Like that, there's nothing that says that, you know, that the town should, if we take over other buildings, we should think about, you know, what do we need to do before we take buildings over so that they are net zero. But I think let's not complicate this one step at a time. We could have two separate recommendations.
I think it's easier to go a step at a time. If you start to get too complicated, you tend to lose everything, because people just won't, oh, we can't, you know, take a step at a time. It's a lot easier. I always tell people it's easier to go from 0 to 10 instead of going from 0 to 100. Every time you try to go from 0 to 100, people just get confused and say, well, we can't do that.
no, I understand.
The other thing to point out here, in this case, is that, you know, because we've got this upcoming, you know, set of goals, this is a really discrete. It's also not, you know, the town isn't building new buildings often. It's rare. And so I think this is something that the select board could go, oh, this is an easy one to pass because we're not going to be building any new buildings. And if you want a new ski lodge, you got to do this.
So if you flip that around, though, if people will choose to retrofit an old inefficient building over buying, building a new, very efficient one, is that setting up an incentive to
Good question.
not build that construction?
That's a good question.
So I was just wondering if there might be a linkage.
I would say that in general, building new buildings is an environmental disaster to begin with, even if they're passive house standards. So you're probably better off retrofitting an old building. Brian would be able to speak more to that.
The embodied energy in an existing building, when you then typically think about, you know, removing that or releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere, and then you think of the carbon footprint of all the new building materials that go into the new building, it's, you know, a long time before, you know, I hate to say this, but before, you know, Pete's passive house is truly passive, because there was a lot of energy that went into the building materials to go into that. Over the long haul, it's very passive. But if, you know, Pete had moved into an existing building and retrofitted it, his carbon footprint would have been lower.
Well, it was an existing building and was retrofitted.
Oh,
So,
sorry, I
yeah.
didn't realize that. I thought it was, I didn't think there was much left of it.
There was walls and
Oh, there
a,
was, okay.
cement
My
floor.
bad. Phil's building, which is a brand-new footprint. And I'm not dishing on Phil, but,
But happily, you can look, now that the building science has become more robust, you can get details on embedded energy for every component of a building and make choices
yeah.
to reduce the embedded energy.
Yeah, and so, yeah, you probably were able to make choices to keep it 25 or 50% below what it would have been if you hadn't done that in the building process. But, in the case specifically of the lodge at the Ragged Mountain Recreation Area, and I intentionally don't call it a ski lodge because that is how it functions in the wintertime for a few months is as a ski lodge. There isn't, that facility doesn't exist. We don't have in a sense, a retrofit option, of that scale to do the sorts of things that we needed to do, just like the wastewater treatment plant. The existing building isn't going to house all of the new stuff that we need to do. We have to rework things to get the function that we must have in that building to meet EPA standards or whatever it is.
Well, thanks. I think we need to move on. We've got 10 more
If
minutes.
everybody could just make more comments on this,
Um,
I'll take a stab.
Yeah, so please look at it online. Pete sent around the draft as a Google document, and you can make comments and so on. Thanks, Pete, for getting us started on that. So next item is the concept of requesting an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer to help us with energy work. I'm not saying we need to do this. I just want us to discuss whether it is of interest to this committee, whether we feel that we have work outstanding that it would really be helpful to have a volunteer do. There's money involved in, you need to pay them, and keep in mind also that the watershed class will be doing work related to the Global Covenant of Mayors for their entire climate change class starting in January through May, which has not been the case in previous years. So I'd like to open that discussion. Does anybody have a comment or
So,
Pearl?
yes, I asked Janet about this, and she said, I like the idea of involving an AmeriCorps volunteer and ideally having them overlap well before our class wraps up in June. It would be great if someone could come on board earlier in the spring and be able to work alongside the students for a few months. Maintaining continuity is key. So that's her take on it.
Janet McMahon, who teaches the climate change class at Watershed. Thank you, Pearl. Does
My
anybody else?
concern is,
Pete?
given the town's already strapped nature in terms of oversight, who would oversee an AmeriCorps volunteer so that they would actually be productive? And that's a concern that I have.
We talked about that last meeting, and trying to remember who volunteered to actually ask the question. Did anybody
Yeah,
get any
Phil
information on that?
Well, I asked the question about AmeriCorps and who needs to supervise,
Right.
but I didn't find out whether there's someone in the town who would like to supervise, if that's what you mean.
Right.
So the committee, sure, you can have a board of a nonprofit and a volunteer on the board can take over supervision.
Okay.
But the key thing is that you have to have a job description. And that's the part that I got some of the details, and there was a guy, Brian Roche, at the state of Maine has their own office, and you can get information from them, but there needs to be something well-developed that's describing what they're going to be doing at least 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And
For what period of time? For summer?
no, summer is too short. I think that there are some programs where you might be able to get someone who's an existing, But I'd have to look into that. This guy, Brian Roche, hasn't gotten back to me after a couple of emails. What I got was a list of the basic requirements for funding the position and some of the paperwork that you have to do. The key thing is that we can't be fuzzy about what we want this person to do. And then you have to think about how much time. So, okay, maybe it's a summer. You might be able to then connect with another town that's using, or a nonprofit that is having an AmeriCorps, and build that into their system by contacting the state. But I think the first thing that would need to happen would be a decision or some thinking about what they'd be doing, and for what the goal was, and the outcomes. All of that needs to be stated.
Absolutely. So the complication is that if we talk about it with regard to the next funding cycle, that funding doesn't become available if it's voted in the positive by the town until the 1st of July. And the reason that we're bringing it up at this point is that this is when the budget starts to get put together. So it's a bit challenging to consider asking for a volunteer if we don't have clarity on what we want that volunteer to do.
And
certainly we could develop that clarity over the next 6 months. But it may not be justified to ask for it if we don't have the clarity.
Having had a conversation with Allison surrounding this a little bit, her suggestion is that we, instead of having an AmeriCorps volunteer, that we have a professional. We pay a professional to basically, once we have our goals from the third round of the Governor and Mayor, and one of those goals may be we need to budget for a professional to come in and, basically hold our feet to the fire. And, be at every select board meeting, every planning board meeting, meet with all the, continually meet with all the department heads to say, well, look, you've got to, you've got to reduce 5% this year. Where's it coming from? And there's going to have to be a professional, well-paid person to do that.
It suggested that too.
I can see that your thoughts about that, and York has taken that step, but they have 3 times as many people and taxpayers, and their tax
Maybe we
base.
collaborate with more than one town or something like
The
that.
tax base is a
I
lot
also
higher.
saw something that indicated to me that York, even though it's bigger, is cooperating on a position that sounds suspiciously like this one in some other, it was indicated in a newspaper article I saw somewhere. So that it maybe even they found it rather expensive. It just seems to me there's no way we would pay for this all by ourselves. So, but if we could find somebody who'd do it for several towns or something like that.
That could be Rockland, Rockport, Camden or something.
Well, you could argue that in some ways, if you're reducing your fuel budget by 5% a year, and that you're going to have extra money to pay for some of these coordinating positions. So
Don't reduce it at zero immediate cost. I mean.
You understand what I'm saying is that there
It
is.
helps to pay for itself.
Exactly.
You may not do it entirely in the first year, but over time, it may be seen as a
I
prudent
also think the
investment.
person wouldn't have anything to do a lot of the time
Well, so that is
for a full-time job.
that's the question I have, is what kinds of things would we be asking? Are they doing the research on the rec, what's behind some of these rec companies, or was that?
Well,
I don't mean,
I think the simplest way that I would think about it, a position like this, whether it be half-time or full-time or whatever, is to be the coordinator for the town to be able to meet the goals that the town has voluntarily adopted, that somebody would be coordinating that effort. And that will require a person to go, hang on a second here, I've looked at your budget, and you don't have a 5% reduction. Where's the 5% reduction?
And perhaps even, perhaps work with them to
Yeah,
find.
let me help you.
Hey, yeah, where are you thinking? Let's find someone who's done that before. What town has done that and how have they done it?
But there will have to be somebody who's tasked to make this happen. So in other words, if it, for example, if I imagine if the town adopts not just municipal buildings need to be net zero by 2050 or whatever, then one of the things that would happen is that person would be at the planning board meetings or sitting with the code enforcement officer saying, yeah, no, that building, the plans that you have submitted will not be, they won't work.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and putting those sort of things into place, it's going to be a big job. Frankly, I think we could probably get rid of all kinds of personnel that are less important than this person would be. I mean, you just have to think about, really, do we need a police chief? Think about that for a minute. In Camden, Maine, do we need a police chief? Maybe not. Maybe we do, maybe we not. But we do need this. We need somebody, if we're really serious about getting to net zero by 2050, we need to be thinking about shifting resources around massively.
So,
Nothing against the chief of police. Yeah, is this that was no. Well, I think that you got to think about everything.
Yeah, I don't think you mean that.
I do mean it.
Well, yes,
I just
know you
mean we need to examine all the positions and say which ones should we prioritize.
So my feeling is that it's premature to come up with a position at this point in time, but the coming year will reveal a lot as we proceed with setting actual goals. And I think when we have more clarity on goals and more clarity on what we need to do, we'll probably have more clarity on what kind of help we need in terms of personnel, volunteers, professionals, whatever. So do others, would you agree?
I would agree, and I think to Pete's point, if we were to look at the overall number for what we're spending for energy right now, it wouldn't be unfair to say, well, if we were to hire somebody to do this work, then look at what that 5% reduction per year or 10% reduction per year would look like. That does help to build the case for, the financial, softens that financial impact of achieving the goals that we're committing to. And that might be a strong lever to toss into the mix.
Okay, well, good. There's something we can chew on in the coming year, I think, as we figure out how to achieve the goals that we're going to be setting.
And we as ourselves could say that, it is our goal to get a full-time, get a person, whatever hours were necessary to allow us to realistically meet the commitments that we've made and are making in terms of the goals.
And I think I think that in this process, it will become clearer what resources are going to be needed in the process of adopting. So I think we will have some clarity on that.
To share, with the select board and, with the community that this is, that this is the direction that we're heading in, because this work is so important and will be so critical to our success that, we're thinking that this is a very viable and reasonable step to take.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see if the numbers can work in favor of funding something like that.
Well, and again,
it's a challenge to consider.
There will be costs associated with it. There's no one in the world who thinks that, mitigating, global climate crisis is going to be without costs or pain. It's just a question of, how do we get there, and what is that cost going to be, and how do you moderate that as best you can? It's not that we're going to eliminate it or make it cash flow positive. It's just what's the smartest way to go about doing this? You got to survive. You got to find. You can't be wasting energy, so to speak.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can put off the other items. It's after 7, so I think do I hear a motion to adjourn at this point?
Yeah.
Second?
Second.
Favor? Okay. So let's adjourn and discuss the other items in the future.
Did you bring up
Thank you.
electric school buses?
No, we're going to do that next time.
Do you have more information? I'm interested.
I'm gonna
I'll
send
stay.
it.
One thing I can tell you about that is I did speak to Maria Libby about it, and there is a grant available to get it, and they've applied for it to get a electric school bus to test.
Wow, they've applied for the grant. Who did they apply to, the state or?
I
Don't
didn't know
remember.
what it is.
Doesn't
They
matter.
said we've applied for a grant to get
Uh-huh.
a school bus to test.
Oh.
So,
There's,
want to run this off? Yeah.
Before you run, you came up in a conversation I had with my-
Make out. I mean, there's the Concord Trailway